The next day, while people were going about their normal lives, Lu Sheng went to a cafe with his old friends. They ordered cake and milkshakes, and while Yang Yuan was drinking quietly, Lin Zi clenched his fists, and with a look full of curiosity asked our boy what the underground battlefield was like. Lu Sheng's attention focused on him, not knowing why he was so interested in knowing this. He intertwined his hands, began to observe his friend, and with a calm expression decided to explain everything in detail. He extended his hand to one side and began to describe what the underground battlefield was like. Upon hearing this, Lin Zi was somewhat surprised, and his gaze filled with excitement. Then Lu Sheng extended his hand toward Yang Yuan and started detailing what the beasts of the battlefield were like. Yang Yuan, who was calmly drinking her shake, couldn't help but feel a bit confused and in shock. And judging by her expression, she didn't care at all about knowing this. Lu Sheng took the milkshake, began to drink, and started observing his friends whom he hadn't seen in a long time and couldn't help but feel happy and at peace. In these 6 months, Lin Zi had darkened quite a bit, in addition to growing taller and more muscular. It was evident that he had been working hard on the martial path. On the other hand, Yang Yuan hadn't changed much, being a little more mature than before. Lin Zi's gaze was filled with surprise and excitement. He stood up and was left speechless upon learning that people could turn into beasts. According to him, Lu Sheng's experiences were too thrilling, while on the other hand, Yang Yuan placed her hand over her chest, and her gaze filled with concern. Upon observing a little more closely, she realized that Lu Sheng had become much stronger. They began to talk to each other, and the hours flew by. Lu Sheng, who was drinking the shake, decided to check what time it was and was somewhat surprised when he looked at his watch and realized it was already very late. He remembered that there was still something to do, so he rested his hands on the table, stood up, and with a kind expression suggested the idea of going out to eat together. Lu Sheng's friend started to observe him and remained silently thinking about this. Lin Zi, who had always liked eating, began to smile and with a serene look said that the idea was good, adding that he knew of a barbecue restaurant that had very good food. Yuan Yu's gaze fixed on our boy and she agreed without hesitation, thinking it was a good idea. But just then, Lu Sheng began to have a strange sensation, leaving him in shock and causing his eyes to fill with fear and confusion, not knowing what was happening. Lu Sheng threw the milkshake on the table, rested his hand on it, and placed the other on his head to try to calm the pain. Seeing this, Yuan Yu approached him, grabbed him by the arm and with a worried expression asked if he was okay. Lin Zi panicked upon seeing this and asked our boy what had happened. Lu Sheng's eyes filled with alertness and concern. He raised his head and apologized to his friends, explaining that he had an important matter to attend to. Upon hearing this, Yuan Yu couldn't help but get nervous and confused. Our boy ran out of the restaurant, started waving goodbye to them with his hand, and with a sincere expression asked them to go eat first with the excuse that he would come later. Yuan Yu remained silent, while on the other side, Lin Zi began saying goodbye to our boy with a smile. Lin Zi's gaze filled with nostalgia as he saw Lu Sheng leaving. He tried to extend his hand toward him to ask him not to go, but then decided not to, realizing that now even eating with Lu Sheng had become something complicated to do. He missed the days when they ate together in the dining hall of the Shengwu Academy. Yuan Yu placed her hands on her chest and couldn't help but start worrying without knowing what had happened to Lu Sheng. At the same time, our boy clenched his teeth tightly because he was beginning to feel uneasy. After moving a little away from the restaurant, he activated his power, gained momentum, and started running at great speed. And seeing his expression, his friends realized that he seemed to be having problems. Today was a wonderful day, perfect for going out for a walk, and not far from the outskirts area, there was a beautiful park, perfect for days like these. While some were celebrating picnics and others were playing with their children, Lu Sheng sat on a bench, lowered his head and remained silent. He began to gaze at the ground with a lost expression and started thinking in silence. Then, he raised his head, and his look was filled with alertness and fear. A moment ago, 13 immortal cells had begun trembling violently, flickering like fireflies. He was feeling an unprecedented sense of crisis striking his consciousness again and again, each time becoming more intense. He didn't know why this was happening. He closed his eyes and decided not to sit idly by and thought it would be better to go search about this in the resource archive. He went to the dream space, where zombies were roaming everywhere. Then, he headed to the resource library where AIE was, and with a worried and curious expression, he asked her to show his vital history. AIE's eyes began to shine, and following our boy's orders, she started projecting several system windows. Lu Sheng began reading carefully and couldn't help but feel calm since nothing had changed. But then, he noticed something, and his gaze became restless, leaving him in shock. In front of him appeared his status window, in which it showed that his life began in June of the year 297 of the Martial Path until January of the year 317 of the Martial Path, leaving him somewhat confused. Upon seeing this, Lu Sheng's eyes filled with fear, and he couldn't help but feel a pressure he had never felt before, realizing that he was going to die this month. The system began to show how Lu Sheng was going to be personally killed by the Extreme Supreme Marshal Zhao Jai at the headquarters of the Ningxi army during the Great Martial Competition, dying at 20 years old. He realized that it was true that he was going to die at the hands of the Extreme Supreme Marshal. He clenched his teeth tightly, and despair and fear consumed his mind. He began to observe the system window and couldn't help but wonder how this was possible. Zhao Jai was only a 9th level Supreme, not a 10th level one, who did not have the absolute power to act without consequences. He knew that Lu Sheng was under the direct protection of the army, and there was also no public evidence incriminating him in Lian Su's death. He didn't know why Zhao Jai had attacked nor what had failed in his plan. He closed his eyes, and as his body released energy, he began to imagine Lian Su smiling, realizing that she was very important to Zhao Jai. But a question came to his mind. He didn't know why he had given in the first time when he had killed Lian Jaibai. Lu Sheng, who was sitting on the bench, came out of the dream space, and his reality began to break into pieces before his eyes, as now his plan that he was so proud of had ended in total defeat. A few hours later, night fell, and then the sun rose again, and the leaves began to blow in the wind. 3 days had already passed, and Lu Sheng was still sitting on the same bench, trying to find the mistake, with his body covered by leaves. Shortly after, Lu Sheng caught the attention of a couple who were calmly strolling through the park. The woman, somewhat confused, started pointing at our boy with her finger and told her boyfriend that they had seen Lu Sheng 3 days ago, and he was still sitting in the same spot. Seeing that his body was covered by leaves, she couldn't help but wonder if he was dead. The man began to observe Lu Sheng and decided to take a look. He approached Lu Sheng, crouched down, placed his hand on his shoulder, and started shaking his body vigorously to remove all the leaves that were on top of him. The leaves fell off, but Lu Sheng still did not move. With a worried and surprised expression, the man realized that his chest was still moving, which meant he was breathing and still alive. The woman placed her hand on her chest and somewhat worriedly asked why he was sitting there, revealing that several days had already passed. The man's gaze filled with curiosity, not knowing what had affected our boy, assuming he must have suffered heartbreak. The woman began to blush, saying that he was quite handsome, so there was no way someone like him could suffer heartbreak. Lu Sheng's eyes were full of despair and exhaustion from not having slept for days because he had been thinking about his death, and upon seeing that he had woken up, the couple became emotional. With a worried expression, the man asked him what had happened and why he had been sitting here for days. With a lost gaze, Lu Sheng replied that it was nothing important. He was just thinking about something he couldn't understand. The man sat down next to him, extended his hand toward his girlfriend indicating for her to leave. Seeing the signal, the woman put her hands behind her back and began to walk away from them to leave him alone. The man became curious upon seeing that Lu Sheng had gone 3 days without finding an answer, and he asked if he could tell him about it. At first, Lu Sheng continued looking at the ground and remained silent. Then, with a desperate look, he revealed that he had been thinking about something he had planned, believing it was perfect. He had even verified it several times with the most reliable institutions, but in the end, everything had gone wrong, and the final result had been completely different from what he had imagined. The man closed his eyes, took a cigarette out of his pocket, started lighting it with the lighter, and felt relieved since he had thought it was something serious. He explained that, as he himself had said, it had been an unforeseen event, revealing that unforeseen events were something normal. Lu Sheng raised his head, began to observe the man, and with a tired gaze argued that he had consulted the experts, and they had assured him there would be no unforeseen events. After lighting the cigarette, the man started looking at the sky and took a drag. Then he turned his head toward him, and with a confident look, began to show 2 fingers, explaining that this only meant that the expert our boy had consulted was not so much of an expert, or maybe was a fraud. Lu Sheng's eyes filled with surprise, and he was in shock upon hearing that the expert wasn't so much an expert but a fraud. The man took another drag from his cigarette, closed his eyes, and mentioned that, as the saying goes, out of 10 things in life, 9 don't turn out the way one wants. He asked why Lu Sheng was complicating things so much. If he had failed, then he could start over from scratch. These words were just what our boy needed. He regained his spirits, stood up, and with a confident expression thought that the man was right. He had been worrying too much by believing he knew more than he actually did. Realizing that nothing in this world is 100% certain, He thanked the man for helping him see this. Upon seeing the sudden change in attitude of our boy, the man couldn't help but be somewhat shocked, and his eyes filled with surprise. Without wasting a second, Lu Sheng turned his back on the man and started running like crazy. Seeing this, the man couldn't help but smile and feel envious, thinking that being young was the best since they had so much energy. A while later, Lu Sheng went to his mansion and made a call to Kingsu. He didn't care if she could come or not, but asked her to take good care of his parents since he could handle this on his own. After saying this, he hung up the call, and his attention fixed on the phone. He had made a mistake, not knowing since when his thoughts had begun to drift. But now, even though he had absolute control over his body, his intellect, and even in a martial god state could understand everything as if he were looking at the lines of his own palm, he realized that he had become too dependent on strategy and not on his fists. He started browsing through his phone, and his eyes filled with joy, causing a smile to appear on his face. For him, sometimes it would be better to be a little more impulsive. He had relied too much on the predictions of the dream space, so much so that he never really stopped to consider it. While the rays of the sun were entering his room through the window, he approached the automatic door, and his eyes filled with confidence. If that so-called future really existed, the recorded past never had errors, but the future could always change, proving that what it showed as future was not a true future, but rather a calculation based on data. Lu Sheng began to look at the ground and a smile appeared on his face, realizing that this explained why the dream space could only show futures where it did not destroy itself. He had always thought that the flapping of a butterfly's wings would not affect something that was going to happen in 10,000 years. He raised his head and with a gaze full of confidence realized that it could not calculate itself. This is the end of the video. If you guys want